You were told that if you studied hard, got a degree, and followed the rules, everything would work out. But somewhere along the way, that promise stopped making sense. And for millions of people, that feeling has a very specific psychological cause. Millennials, the generation born roughly between 1981 and 1996. They grew up between two completely different worlds. Before them, there was Generation X. After Millennials came Generation Z. Gen Z was born directly into the internet. But Millennials are different. They are the only generation that remembers life before the internet and life after it took over everything. They used cassette tapes and floppy disks, but also streaming apps and cloud storage. They played outside without phones, but later built entire identities online. Psychologists often call them a transitional generation because their brains developed during a time when the rules of society, work, and technology were constantly changing. And that created a very specific psychological profile. Older generations often describe millennials as entitled, overly emotional, or obsessed with comfort. But psychology tells a different story. In many ways, millennials aren't soft. They're simply the first generation forced to constantly adapt. But the real question is this: why does the millennial generation feel so different from the ones before and after it? Why do so many of them report anxiety about careers, money, and the future, even when they did everything they were told? The answer starts with a psychological concept called expectation conditioning. When people grow up hearing the same message over and over, their brain begins to treat it as a guaranteed outcome. And millennials heard one message more than anything else: work hard, go to college, get a degree, and life will be stable. For decades, that formula mostly worked. Gen X saw it work, boomers lived through it. So parents, teachers, and institutions repeated the same advice. And millennial brains absorbed it as a rule of reality. But then the environment changed. The early 2000s brought global instability, wars, rising tuition, corporate layoffs, and then came the 2008 financial crisis. Millions of millennials graduated directly into one of the worst job markets in decades. Cause: global recession. Effect: fewer opportunities, lower salaries, unstable careers. But here's the psychological problem. Their brains were trained for stability in a world that suddenly became unstable. This creates something psychologists call expectation-reality conflict. When reality doesn't match what your brain was prepared for, it produces chronic stress. Not short-term stress, long-term uncertainty. Because the brain keeps asking, if I did everything right, why doesn't it feel right? And that question doesn't just affect careers, it affects identity. Millennials were the first generation told to follow their passion. That sounds empowering, but psychologically, it creates a new pressure. Now your job isn't just about survival, it's about meaning. So if your career feels empty, it doesn't just feel like a job problem, it feels like a life problem. This is called identity-based work pressure. Previous generations often separated work from identity. You worked to provide, not to feel fulfilled. But millennials were trained to merge the two. So when the job market became unstable, their identity became unstable too. And that's where the anxiety loop begins. Unstable job leads to unstable income. Unstable income leads to delayed milestones. Delayed milestones lead to social comparison. And social comparison leads to self-doubt. But here's where technology made everything more intense. Millennials entered adulthood at the exact moment social media exploded. So while they were struggling with debt, rent, and unstable careers, they were also watching everyone else's highlight reels. Someone got promoted. Someone bought a house, someone got married, someone started a business. And the brain processes all of this as comparison data. Psychologists say the human brain evolved to compare itself to a small social group, maybe 20 or 30 people. But social media expanded that number to hundreds or even thousands, and the brain wasn't designed for that. So it starts to feel like it's constantly behind, even when it isn't. This creates a psychological state called perceived life delay. It's the feeling that your life isn't moving as fast as it should, not because of actual failure, but because of constant comparison. And this is one of the reasons millennials often delay major life events, not just because of money, but because of uncertainty. When the future feels unstable, the brain avoids permanent decisions. So instead of buying houses, they rent. Instead of one lifelong career, they change paths. Instead of early marriage, they wait. To older generations, this looks like hesitation. But psychologically, it's adaptation. The millennial brain learned one core lesson: nothing stays stable for long. So it values flexibility over permanence, experience over ownership, meaning over status. But that mindset also comes with a cost. Constant adaptation is mentally exhausting. Psychologists call this chronic adjustment fatigue. When your environment keeps changing, your brain never fully relaxes. It stays in problem-solving mode, always preparing for the next shift, the next crisis, the next disruption. And over time, that creates burnout. Not because millennials are lazy, but because their brains have been in survival mode for years. And here's the twist. The same environment that created their anxiety also created their strengths. Millennials are highly adaptable, technologically fluent, emotionally expressive, and socially aware. They're comfortable with change because change is all they've known. They can switch careers, learn new tools, move cities, or rebuild their identity if needed. And psychologically, that flexibility is powerful. So what does all this mean? Millennials aren't entitled. They're transitional. They were raised with one set of expectations and forced to live by another. They were promised stability, but trained in instability. And their psychology reflects that contradiction. If you're a millennial and feel uncertain about your path, you're not broken. You're not behind. You're just part of a generation that had to grow up in a world that kept changing. And that constant adaptation may end up being your greatest strength.